Thanks for dropping in, and welcome to another installment of Sculptember, where I learned Nomad Sculpt on the iPad. In the last video, we made a ghost and a mummy. I'm going to continue that theme in this video with a Frankenstein monster. Now this is more of an art journal than a tutorial. I'll show you the process as I try to figure things out, and talk through the tools and what I'm thinking as I'm going. Let's start by adding a sphere for the head. I'm going to size that to match my sketch here. Then I'll validate it and use the Move tool to squish it into a more squarish form. I have symmetry turned on, so any changes I make to one side of the sphere will affect the other side equally. Now I'm going to use the Flatten tool to create some flat surfaces for the face. I'm not going to worry too much about getting these details perfectly, because most of the facial features are going to be built on top of the face. This is just to get the overall structure of the head. One thing I'm trying to focus on for this model compared to the others is I want to have a lot of sharp edges between the features. And for that, you're going to see me use the Flatten tool a whole lot. Okay, we have a good starting shape for the face, so let's go ahead and add an upper lip. I'll start with a sphere and then drag it into place. We can use the Gizmo tool to get the initial overall size and position, and then the Move tool to once again squish and push and pull it so it's an approximation of the sketch. Speaking of the sketch, this model isn't going to reflect it 100%, partly because I like to change plans a little bit as I go, but also the sketch itself isn't a perfect representation of a three-dimensional object. That's approximately the shape I want, so I'm going to use the Flatten tool to chisel in a sharp line between the underside of the upper lip and the front side of the upper lip. That's a good start. Let's go ahead and add the lower lip. Once again, we're going to use a sphere and then resize it and position it using the Gizmo tool. Now we'll use the Move tool to push it into shape. You're going to see me reuse this process over and over again, because so far it's been the most reliable technique. Now let's add the tooth. For this I'll just use a regular cube. We'll move that around with the Gizmo tool. Let's angle the tooth a bit so it's more interesting. Now let's create the cheeks. Since there's two of them, we'll add a mirror object and then position them with the Gizmo tool. These shapes are extra tricky. It's going to take a lot of use of the movement tool to get things in place. The head's sticking out a little bit too far. Let's push that in a bit. Now I'm going to try to scoop out the bottom of each cheekbone to give Frankenstein that gaunt look. Well, that's a mistake. I had symmetry turned on. Let's go ahead and reverse that and turn symmetry off and try again. You can see where the top corner of the cheekbone is actually rounding out when I use the Flatten tool. So I'll pull that in further and then go back to the Flatten tool to keep refining the shape. Next, let's add the nose. I could probably do this with a cylinder or a box, but another sphere seems to work just fine. Now I'll use the Move tool to create the overall boxy shape we were looking for with the nose. And we want that bridge to round out and sink into the forehead. I like that shape overall, so let's add those chiseled lines. Let's move on to the eyes, starting with the lower eyelid. I'm going to drag this object into the mirror group, so we have two of them. Now we'll resize and position them with the Gizmo tool, and, you guessed it, we'll use the Move tool to squish it into shape. We really have to give Frankenstein that tired look. And we're back with the Flatten tool to create some more internal sharp lines, starting with the front of the eyelid and then the top. Time to add the upper eyelids, which is the same process as before. Unlike the sketch, I'm going to make these upper eyelids a little bit larger. That's because I want this to contain a fully round eyeball. These are some of the considerations that come up while modeling that I might not think about while drawing the initial sketch. Now let's add the actual eyeball. At first I tried to push the eyeball in shape to fit with the eyelids, but I really don't like how that looks. So instead, let's drop in a perfect sphere and move around the eyelids to work with that. Yeah, I think that's a lot better, but the forehead looks a little bit small. So let's pull that up to get more of that Frankenstein look. Really square it up. Now let's add the classic Frankenstein brow. Of course, I'll resize it and position it with the gizmo tool. And once that's in place, it's to the move tool to create the overall shape. Even though this is ultimately going to be an asymmetrical shape, I'm starting this with symmetry mode turned on. And now back to the flatten tool to bring out those sharp lines. Now let's turn symmetry mode off and create that uneven brow from the sketch. This needs a little more refining with the flat tool. Okay, that looks pretty good from the front, but from the side, I can see that the chin has really sunk in. So let's switch back to the head and try to pull that out to give Frankenstein a stronger jaw. I also want to add this little extra bit to the chin. Just like with everything else, I'm using the gizmo tool to position it and resize it, and the flatten tool to really chisel in the hard edges. Next, let's add some pupils. We want that to be in the mirror group because there's two of them. And I'm going to use the gizmo tool to turn them into kind of oval shapes. And like everything else in this model, I'm using the flatten tool to give them some sharp internal lines. I can easily waste way too much time trying to position and reposition these pupils. So I'll leave it like this for now and come back to it later. Let's double check that from the side view. It looks like the lips are a little too high, so let's bring those down. Next, let's add the ears. These should be lined up about even with the eyes. There's two of them, of course, so let's move them into the mirror group. As with everything else, I want to add some sharp internal lines. Those look a little droopy. Let's try that again. I might add a little more detail to these later, but for now I'm keeping it simple. Okay, that should be a pretty good start. That matches the front view pretty well, so now I'm just going to smooth out all of these shapes. For that, I'll go to the voxel menu and remesh these at a higher resolution. I'm not quite sure what resolution to pick yet, so I'll just go with 200 for now. The next step is really slow and boring, so I'm just going to fast forward through all of it. I'm just selecting each shape individually and increasing the mesh resolution. Then I'm using the flatten tool to really smooth out the surface of the mesh. In a few cases, you'll see some line artifacts that are from the flatten tool. In those cases, I use the smooth tool to even those out. That's looking pretty good. Let's try adding the forehead scar. For that, I'm going to use the tube tool. We'll just draw a squiggly line up here, then reposition these points using snap turned on. If I click the radius option 3 times, I can change the size of the profile at every point along the line. So let's make that thicker on top and a little point here on the bottom. Since everything else about this model is sharp, I'm going to change the profile of this tube into a triangle. And now I'm going to take way too long messing with the scar's position. Alright, I've been putting this off for way too long. It's time to model Frankenstein's hair. This is starting to look like an 80s businessman cut. Let's remesh it and start to flatten it out to give it that classic Frankenstein look. Now that I have some hair in place, the forehead looks like it needs a bit of work. So let's push that around a bit. The forehead has moved so much that the scar is completely invisible. We need to bring that back to the front. Let's hide the hair and move these pieces around until we get something that looks good. Okay, the head's looking pretty good, so I'm going to save my progress before moving on to the body. I'm going to start with the upper torso, using the same technique we used for the face. I'll add a sphere, then squish it into shape using the Move tool, and refining that shape with the Flatten tool. I'm slowly picking up on a technique with using the Flatten tool. If you start near the center of the shape you want to flatten, and then work your way out, that seems to give better results. This character design is really short and squat, so I'm fighting all my instincts to take all these features and stretch them out vertically. Now let's add the legs. I shortened the leg here using the Flatten tool set to a very large radius. To maintain a simple cartoony look, I'm trying to keep the pants down to as few shapes as possible. Now I'll add Frankenstein's boxy shoes. I didn't notice this at the time, but the shoe is pointing way too far inward. If I had mirrored the shoe earlier, I would have caught the issue and saved myself a lot of trouble later. I suspect that this terrible footwear is the real reason behind Frankenstein's anger issues, other than the villagers and the pitchforks and the fire. I decided to add some cuffing to the pants using the tube tool. This helps hide the seam between the leg and the shoe. The void that's created by the cuffing could become a printing issue. You don't want to have sudden empty space in the middle of a model. To avoid that issue, I added a sphere and mushed it into place. Now I know the leg is entirely solid. Here I did a little more refinement and tweaking to get the shoe and pants to work together. Next up, I'll work on the arms. Just like with the legs before, I want the arm to be as few shapes as possible. In fact, the front of the arm wraps all the way around to the back, making it one continuous plane. And here's that trick again, where I use the Flatten tool to really shorten the length of the arm. I'm checking the proportions again to make sure that everything's still pretty much in line with the sketch. One thing I didn't like about the sketch was how the head just sits directly on the body. So I'll add a neck and then rework the torso a bit. Time to work on the hands. I wasn't 100% sure what shape I wanted to go with here, but I did know I wanted it to be blocky and a little bit fist-like. So I added a sphere and then used the Flatten tool to create lots of blunt, flat planes. At the very end of the process, I actually go back to this hand and add some fingers that are pointing in a backward direction. That gives the hand a sort of knuckle-dragging posture. Now it's time to make the suit coat. To do that, I clone the upper torso and then expand it slightly. To open up the suit coat, I add a box, resize it a bit, and then join it with the suit coat with that box set to hidden. This turns it into a subtraction tool, or a negative Boolean shape, that cuts the opening into the suit coat. At this point, I'm making a huge mistake. This suit coat is way too short, and unfortunately, I don't notice that until much later in the process. I was getting kind of bored working on the torso, so I set that aside for a bit to work on Frankenstein's hair. This hair is going to get reworked quite a few times as I bounce back and forth between something that's a little more stylish versus something that's just a plain flat top. Okay, that's enough delay. Time to work on the suit's collar. For that, I'm going to create a giant cheese wedge of a shape. There are absolutely faster ways to create this shape, but I found this roundabout process almost therapeutic. Now I'll use the Gizmo tool to move the collar in place, and the Move tool to mush it onto the suit coat. This would have been a great moment for me to notice that the suit coat is still way too short. Did I notice? No. The spot where the point of the collar runs into the suit coat is something that's easy to draw, but not great to model. I have 4 separate planes coming in at that same point. So I flatten it out a little bit to cheat, and then create a softer transition between the collar and the soup coat. In retrospect, it would have been easier if I had added the collar to the soup coat before I opened it up. Here I used the tube tool to extend the coat's collar behind Frankenstein's head. This is very close to the technique I used for the mummy's bandages. I just placed the tube and then flattened it out on a couple sides. At this point, I merged the collar into the soup coat, making it far more difficult to modify as a separate piece. I did eventually realize that the soup coat was too short, but at that point, it was already too late to just undo my progress. So I added a cylinder, stretched it into shape, and spent most of my time blending that cylinder and the soup coat together to make it the right length. What you're seeing here is that repair process, which took nearly an hour. And here we have a repaired soup coat. The surface texture is a little rough in some spots, but I go back to that later to repair it. This Frankenstein model doesn't have much of a neck, but I wanted to add the classic bolts anyway. So I added a cylinder set to a very low resolution, giving it only 6 sides. Then I rounded all the edges, and then squared them off using the flatten tool. This gave the bolt head a nice hand-forged look. Then it was just a matter of figuring exactly where these bolt heads would fit. We're quickly getting to the point of final tweaks and refinements. I modify Frankenstein's expression, his nose, his hair, and just about every single shape I've modeled. At some point in this process, I threw out the scar and decided to recreate it from scratch. But I used the same process as before, the tube tool, with varying diameters along its length, set to a triangular profile. We finally have something ready to 3D print, so I'll get that running and see you in a second. I'm back with the print, or maybe I should say, a whole bunch of prints. Over a half-dozen revisions, I slowly updated the model to make it easier to 3D print. And I'm happy to report that with the right hardware, this final version can be printed without any supports. You just print the design on its head. You can print it right side up, of course, but if you do so, make sure you add supports under the jacket and under the chin. And there we have it. The third Sculptember model is done. I'll be back next week with another design. But that should do it for now. So until next week, happy printing, and thanks for stopping by. Alright, that was another extra long video. But I have a bonus clip at the end anyway for everyone who knew to stick around. A month ago, I released this little round shutter fidget, which has a rotating center and 2 sides that rotate independently from each other. A few people mentioned that they wanted only the shutter to rotate, so I released an update where the central shutter still rotates, but the 2 frame parts are locked together. If you're one of the many that requested this feature, I hope this update will work for you. Okay, back to Nomad Sculpt for me. Later.